and years and years on artistic representations of the crucifixion. On pictures of the crucifix, for instance, that describe for us the crucifixion. In more recent times, we're more reliant on motion pictures that show us about the crucifixion of Jesus. And the reason we had to go to those other sources is that we haven't really known that much about crucifixion. At least not until about 40 years ago. About 40 years ago, in a tomb in Jerusalem, we found the skeletal remains of a man who had been crucified in the first century. And based on those skeletal remains, we now understand how people were crucified in Palestine in the first century world. I want to talk a little bit about that because I'm not so sure we all understand what crucifixion is about. Crucifixion, to give you a little bit of historical information, crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. But my friends, the Romans perfected that practice. Crucifixion was also not intended to kill. It was intended to prolong death. The purpose of crucifixion was to get the criminal to the point of begging to be put out of their misery. And it often succeeded in that purpose. Contrary to popular belief, crucifixion did not begin simply with attaching the victim to the cross. Crucifixion actually began with the flogging. We have this in Mark's Gospel. Mark simply says in a rather matter-of-fact way, and after flogging Jesus, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Let me describe for you just briefly what, in fact, is involved with flogging. Maybe you've seen some of these movies that show Jesus being flogged. Some of the ones like Jesus Christ Superstar, and some of those others, The Passion of the Christ, and some of those have sort of a guy who sort of slaps a whip on the back of Jesus, and he has sort of these little lipstick marks or whatever on the back, and that's supposed to be flogging. Well, that's not flogging. If any of you have seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, you know that flogging involves more, I think. It didn't involve quite as much as Mel Gibson wanted. I don't think they turned you over and did you on the other side the way Mel Gibson did, but flogging was a serious, serious part of crucifixion. Flogging was done with a device called a cat of nine tails. 9 strips of leather bound together in a leather handle. And on the end of each of those strips of leather was a ball. And embedded in that ball were pieces of metal and glass. Now the victim was stripped. Again, we're so used to seeing people with loincloths and the like. No way. Strip naked. And the criminal would be tied to a pillar, and then an official, a centurion, would take that cat of nine tails and would whip the person with it as hard as he could. The problem is that with this device, it often stuck in the flesh. So what you had to do was to jerk it out to get it back. And then you would hit him again and jerk it out to get it back. And then you would hit him again and hit him again and hit him again. And you can see very quickly how, using a device like that, your shoulders would be shredded, your back, your buttocks, your thighs, your stomach. All of that was intended to get the juices flowing. It wasn't intended to kill, although some people never got past the post. They were, in fact, killed by the flogging. But the flogging was intended to get the juices flowing. Because if the juices flow, if you start to lose a lot of blood, your blood sugar drops. And your ability to resist diminishes dramatically. That's probably what happened to Jesus. He was unable, as a result of the flogging, to carry the cross. We know that he falls under the weight of it. Come back to that in just a minute. After one is flogged, one is then walked to the place of execution. You aren't carried there, you have to walk. And you don't walk the most direct route, you walk the most circuitous route, because the point of crucifixion was deterrence. Romans wanted others to know what would happen to them if they stepped out of line. So you paraded the criminal through the streets of the town. You did that, though, with the person carrying the instrument of his death. It'd be like a person being hanged, getting ready to be hanged, carrying the rope to the site of execution. Now, what would be carried to the site of execution would have been the crossbar. I love to watch all these Jesus movies and see Jesus being crucified, dragging this big, huge monstrosity through the streets. He would have carried the crossbar. The upright would already have been embedded at the site of execution. So they would have put on his shoulders something that would be like a railroad tie. And then his arms would be draped over it and probably tied. And that's what he falls under. The weight of that, he falls down. Not because he's strong, not because he's not strong, but the fact that he probably was beaten to within an inch of his life during the flogging. Someone else carries his cross, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, you were walked around through the town, the most circuitous route, and then you get to the site of execution. The site of execution, again, was always a very public spot. It was often as you entered a city or as you left the city, the main gate. Because they wanted people to know that if you entered this town and screwed up, this is what would happen to you. So you were crucified in a prominent place. It says he's crucified at Golgotha, which must be some kind of hill just right outside of the city, a place where everyone coming into that town would be able to see him. Well, how are you attached to the cross? Well, we know now in light of the archaeological excavation that I mentioned a few moments ago that nailing was something that was fairly common in the first century world. We always thought, or for many years it was believed, that Jesus was nailed. That was a especially difficult treatment that Jesus himself received. But there are skeletal remains that show that this individual was nailed as well. In fact, a nail was driven through some bones in the individual, and it must have hit a knot in the wood because it bent. When they pulled the person off the cross, they couldn't get the nail out. So he was buried with the nail in his bones. And that gives us a big clue about how people were actually attached to the cross. First of all, it's important to point out that the arms were attached first. Now you probably all know this, so I don't need to tell you, but I will say it anyhow. On the skeletal remains that we have, the scarring is not between, or the scratches are not in the palm of the hand, but in fact in the wrist area. What's scratched are the radius and the ulna, the two bones that form the wrist. I happen to have a true first century nail. That's a real first century nail, called a crucifixion nail. And this is the kind of thing that would have been used to attach someone to a cross. Now they would have put a board down over the person's wrist. They would throw you on the ground, stretch your arms out, put a board over your wrist, and then nail this through the board and then through the wrist to pin you to that crossbar. You were still probably tied to the crossbar as well, so you were not only being held up by this nail, but the nail certainly was holding you to the cross. The crossbar was then probably lifted up and placed on the upright that probably had a notch. And the crossbar probably had a hole in it that fit down over that notch. So the cross itself may have been more of a T shape than a cross that we normally think of. After you get the person up in that position, then you've got to attach the lower legs. And here we have information from the skeletal remains that shows us how the legs were nailed to the cross. Because what happens with the skeletal remains is that the nail penetrated the heel bones. Which means that either Jesus would have been turned sideways like this, and a single nail driven through his heel bones in this direction. Or else his legs were crossed like this, and a single nail would have been nailed through his heel bones in this position. In either case, again, a piece of wood would be put over the site and a nail driven through the wood first. And we have a piece of the acacia wood with this skeletal remain that I was talking about on the nail. So we have the nail, the wood, and then the bone that it penetrated.